So tell me about your relationship with Eric Bischoff then, because I mean, he's always talked about as I said earlier, he's always talked about the limitations he faced from a corporate standpoint in WCW. You worked with him, and he's referenced a lot in this book, and you've given a very fair and balanced account of the wider corporate environment that he found himself in. How did your relationship with Eric develop as you were writing this book, and how did that ultimately lead to you writing his book, as I mentioned at the start, Grateful, which I've got here as well?
Well, I appreciate you picking that up also. It's quite interesting because, again, I'm very grateful, if we could use that word, that Eric agreed to be interviewed in the first place for the book. I think he gave me about 4.5 hours of his time over a couple of different days. And I really tried to focus on subjects that he hadn't talked about to death. At this point, it's quite interesting now because you think about all the wrestling podcasts that have popped up. Mm. But at this point, everyone was pretty much sick of the Monday Night Wars. It was almost like there's nothing left to be said. How many different times are we going to regurgitate the same stories? And so I thought, if I have the chance to get him on the phone, knowing that he's done 10,000 interviews about this, I don't want to say, so tell me, how did Nitro come about then in the first place? Wasn't there a meeting with you and Ted? Like, we're not gonna go over old ground, right? So I think we had a good couple of interviews initially for the book. But that was the extent of my communication with Eric. So the book came out, and I assumed that at some point he was going to read it, or someone was going to clue him in as to what the book was all about. But I didn't know that for sure. But I'll never forget, it was about 5 or 6 weeks after the book came out, and all of a sudden I woke up one day and I was just getting emails and messages, and Amazon was going crazy, and it was clear something had happened, right? Because the book, I was lucky that almost from the start, the book was received extremely well. And it was already building a lot of momentum. People were discovering it. They were talking about it. We were already sort of on that road. But what gave it rocket fuel, I think, was one day when Eric and Conrad got on 83 Weeks and just gave this glowing, assessment of the book and blew me away with how they described it. I mean, honestly, because I had no idea that was going to happen. Also, keeping in mind that if you or I were in Eric's shoes and we're reading a book about a company that we were heavily involved in, and there's some content in that book that doesn't really portray us in the most positive light and may even be embarrassing at times, would you or I have the character to say, you know what, that was tough to read at times, but it's fair. That's what actually happened, and people need to go read the story. That's what Eric did. And so I really thought that was just so commendable and so rare, because you don't come across a lot of people in life, period, who would do something like that, especially when there's no benefit for them, right? Again, we can sit here and say, yeah, I would do the same thing. I would be man enough to divorce myself from that. But our natural human tendency would be to say, this is a bunch of bullshit. Don't believe this crap that they're talking about me. So I think, once that happened, and then Eric and I subsequently met at the first Starcast in Chicago, and he said the exact same thing to me in person. He said, I got to hand it to you. You did an amazing job, and it's what happened, and he said, I just want to shake your hand. And we ended up doing a panel then at the second Starcast in Vegas, which I was so thankful, for Conrad and his whole team to put on, which was really based around the Nitro book in part. And I guess we got to talking after that panel, and we kind of said, if there's a chance for us to work together on something, maybe we should explore it. Well, shortly after that, he ended up going back to WWE, if you remember, for that very short tenure. So I think at that point, I thought, okay, this is something I'm going to have to revisit in a few years, because he's probably going to be tied up with WWE now for a long period of time. Well, obviously that didn't last very long. So we revisited it and knocked around a couple of different ideas, but ultimately settled on, let's just pick up the story from Controversy Creates Cash, because a lot of stuff has happened in your life in this 15-year or so period, not just as it relates to wrestling, and all of that content is in there, all of the TNA stuff and the things people want to read about, but just the journey that he's been on, I think, in terms of, having so many business successes, but also some very drastic failures and filing for bankruptcy and being in a position where he and his wife and his family more broadly were in quite a bit of difficulty when it came to money, and so having the opportunity to work with him on Grateful was just fantastic. And I think as having read the book, you'll see that in the same way that he was very honest about his assessment of the NITRO book, he was very honest about himself in Grateful as well. This isn't just chapter after chapter of Eric, in wrestling parlance, putting himself over and, deflecting blame from certain things and talking about, what a genius he was in all circumstances. There's many aspects of this where he's really engaging in a lot of self-reflection, putting his hand up and saying, I was to blame there, I messed up, here's how I learned from it. And ultimately, the way that the book ends is with him being in this mindset, which I think is quite genuine today for the most part, which is looking back on this crazy journey that he's been on in his life and, saying, yeah, there were some crazy highs, there were some really bad lows, but wow, I'm so grateful that it actually happened. So we don't beat you over the head with it. It doesn't start that way and continue that way throughout the entire book. If you've heard Eric on his podcast at times tear into people, he's going to do that in the book as well, rest assured. But ultimately it ends up in a really, really nice place. And that wasn't something that we manufactured. That was genuinely something that came out as a result of our conversations. And personally, I was happy to be a part of that because, like yourself, I sort of have the mindset that there's enough negativity out there when it comes to wrestling and the content that's produced about it. That's not to say it can't be entertaining at times, but how nice is it to actually end up a story on a happy note, right? The final chapter wasn't, well, my life's in ruins. It was, I'm in my late 60s and I'm looking forward to what's coming ahead. And I just think that's really refreshing, especially in this day and age.